Good evening, all. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you all. To begin with, we would like to introduce ourselves. This is my wife, Lorena, and I am Gonzalo. We are Spanish, born in Spain, and we are here to present our school, which has been open for over 20 years in Florence, and it's called the New Gnostic Academy S.A.W. of Florence. And today's talk on the Initiatic Camino of Santiago is to present our course and also to have fun with this topic, which is very nice, or at least I hope that everybody will enjoy this. So the aim is not just the talk within itself, as I have said, but it is to present the course which is going to start next Tuesday and will take place every Tuesday evening, and if nothing changes, the time will be 8:30 p.m. The meetings always take place in two parts. One theoretical part where we explain what the inner work is and why we should do an inner work on ourselves in order to reach that which we call the being. And after all these explanations, every day we have a second part of the meeting, which is a practical part. We start by teaching the meditation practice in all of its stages. And then little by little, as we go forward into the program, which consists of 33 meetings, then we also practice other disciplines which have as an objective the activation of the consciousness. What do we mean by consciousness? It's the part of our psyche that is not conditioned. So there is a part within us that is unconditioned by social, religious, historical, familiar norms, etc., etc. It is the objective part within us that we need to seek, because it is only through that that one can generate true change. If I rely on my personality, if I rely on my mind, if I rely on my subconsciousness, then it is impossible to produce any change or any awakening. I can only awake within myself if I enter in contact with that part of the being, which is the consciousness, through practice. The consciousness is an atom, a nous atom, as Plato called it. An atom of our being. The being is our reality. We are beings. This body is only temporary. It is a tool whose aim is to reach a connection with our own being, our own true reality. So the true initiatic path of Santiago, which we're going to look at, is a path within oneself, a connection of ourselves as consciousness with our own being. So to explain this in just 1 minute is not enough, because it's not an ideal. It is and should be a reality. We don't only create a mystical contact with our being, but we can incarnate our being. We can become our being. The being can manifest, and we can finally become that which we truly are, which is beings. A being that will express itself through this physical body, this energetic body, this emotional body, the famous astral body, the mental body, and the body of will. So the being shouldn't have the obstacles that we have created existence after existence, such as a complex mind, confused feelings, etc., etc. So it's understandable that this work cannot be done in 4 days. So it has to be explained well and then put into practice. And this is what we do during our Tuesday meetings. Tuesday is the day that we dedicate to the beginners groups, because we have groups every evening. With the school that has been there for over 20 years, we have several groups. So Tuesday is the day that we have dedicated to those who want to begin this journey with us. There are always 3 free days where one can attend. So today's public talk and then 2 other meetings. And one can evaluate whether it's something that they're interested in. And after these 3 days, there is a monthly fee of 35 euros, and that includes 4 or 5 Tuesdays each month. Obviously, there is no obligation, and this is the topic that we are presenting, and we have chosen this topic because I was born half an hour away from Santiago. My wife is from a region which is closer to France and the Basque country. I am from the Atlantic Ocean, which is half an hour away from Santiago of Compostela. All my family is there, and so it's a topic that I feel very comfortable with. I know it very well. We always joke with Lorena that we have to do this Camino every year because her family is at the start of the Camino near the Pyrenees, and mine is at the very end. And so every year when we visit our families, we have to do the Camino. We don't do it on foot every year, otherwise we wouldn't get the chance to see our families, but we do know it well, and we have done it on foot. When we were a bit younger, and we don't know how much you know of it, but I hope, and I'm sure you will find it interesting. It is a good example that could give an idea of what we do and what our approach is, what Gnosis is. Okay, so having introduced ourselves, Gonzalo and Lorena, and our school, the Gnostic Academy, and what Gnosis is. Gnosis comes from the Greek word which means knowledge, and it does not refer to intellectual knowledge, but to knowledge through revelation. It is direct knowledge which I can access by creating this relationship that I've spoken about between my consciousness, the unconditioned part, and my being. And from that moment onwards, the being and all its parts instruct me. And I'm not talking just on a spiritual level, because it would be absurd to separate the spirit from the matter, because both of these things are part of our lives. So our consciousness and our being can address us and guide us to make certain choices about our physical and material life, and therefore also my spiritual life. And this is the direct knowledge that the Greeks spoke about. It's what they meant by gnosis. Gnosis is not a religion, it's not a condition, it's in fact the complete opposite. It seeks freedom of one's subconscious, of one's conditioning, personal, social, etc. Gnosis is a syncretism. Nowadays we call it gnosis, but the name is not important. It's the content of the Hermetic, Gnostic teachings of all traditions. One cannot pinpoint a time when Gnosis was born, because Gnosis was born when man was born, because he sought this internal connection with his own deeper inner truth. And from that moment onwards, different practices were born, disciplines, in order to live Gnosis, because Gnosis is not a philosophy, it's not a theory. It has to be lived for it to be Gnosis. Gnosis is a direct personal experience. Without a personal experience, there is no Gnosis. Even though our school is called an academy in Italy, because ours is an international institute, and in Italy we are registered as an academy. And this name was inspired by the Neoplatonic Academy of Florence, but we don't exist just in Florence. And even though our name is academy, we are not an academic school. This is a powerful topic that we talk about with our students, because even though many have been there for many years, they don't feel good when we tell them this. We tell them to motivate them so that they don't just spend time studying or listening to Lorena and I without living and putting into practice what we are learning. Okay, so in summary, this is what the Academy is, just to explain it a little, and at the end of the conference we can also welcome any questions you might have. I don't want to go on and on because the Camino is long. It's over 900 kilometers around the world. So we should slowly start talking about this. So first of all, what is the Camino of Santiago? So the Camino of Santiago is a telluric line, an energetic current of the planet Earth. There are two very important lines in Spain, which, not by coincidence, go to form a T, which not only represents the Tao of the Templars, but it is also the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The Tau is the symbol of Saint Francis, who was not an Orthodox Catholic, certainly. He knew the mysteries, the Hermetic mysteries. And he actually traveled to Santiago to visit the alchemists that existed at that time in Santiago of Compostela. And he also traveled to Jerusalem to meet the Sufis and to get to know the Arabic Hermetic traditions. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, that the Camino of Santiago is a telluric line. So just as we have a physical and an energetic body, so does every other living being. The animal, the plant, and the mineral kingdom, and even more so, a planet. And what science calls an electromagnetic field is basically the energetic body of Gaia, of the planet Earth. This was first measured by a German Dr. Harman, who became a doctor in Germany between the 1850s and the 1870s. He had an intuition, and then he created some machine which was able to measure these currents of the earth, which is what the Druids and the Celts used to talk about. These fields have now taken his name, Harman, but obviously it's not something that he invented. Ancient tribes didn't need machines to measure these electromagnetic fields because they could perceive them, they could feel them, because they had an awakened consciousness, so they already spoke about this. So these telluric lines of the earth are measurable in accordance with what Herman has discovered. And he even went as far as to say that many of today's illnesses are due to a poor relationship with one's own energetic body, and we're going to explore this today. So due to a lack of transmutation of one's own energy, etc. So the veins of the earth are approximately 20 to 22 centimeters in width, and they produce themselves every 2 to 2.5 kilometers. And so a map forms within the whole planet Earth that is basically formed by these telluric lines. And the Camino of Santiago runs along one of these famous telluric lines, which is the parallel 42. The parallel 42, where Santiago is found, is very interesting, because here we find certain points of the planet Earth that we're going to talk about that are very important on a spiritual level. So here we can see the parallels, the meridians, and now we're talking about the parallel 42. So if I look on the right along the parallel 42, I can see, which we can still find today in Spain, Montserrat, which is a very important place within spirituality, esotericism. We say that that is where the real sacred grail is. Then if we follow the line, we reach Italy. And which city do we find along parallel 42? It's Assisi, which is very important for Italians. And if we then continue, we can see along Macedonia, along Albania, Bulgaria, where during the early medieval times, a very important spiritual movement was formed here, called the Bogomils. The Bogomil movement was very similar to the Cathar movement and the Albigensians, followed then by other Templar movements. So in that area of Macedonia, the north of Albania, Bulgaria, this important esoteric group was born in the 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th century, the Bogomines. And if we continue on the right, we reach Armenia, where there is the famous sacred Mount Ararat. If we carry on even further, we reach the Quanju sacred Mount of China, and we then reach the Gobi Desert. According to the Tibetan tradition, Shambhala is found. the sacred city of Shambhala, where the Logos of the planet Earth lives, and by following on, we then reach also a sacred Japanese sanctuary. Whereas if we look on the left side of Spain and we follow the parallel 42, it touches the Iowa states in the United States. And the state of Iowa is where a very important indigenous American tribe was born. And there is a very important natural reserve, which they call the Natural Park of Iowa, because that is where one of the indigenous American tribes was born, such as the Lakota, and other tribes as well that reached a very important spiritual level. So you might ask yourselves, is it just the parallel 42 north? No, it is also in the parallel 42 south, which touches, for example, less land because there is the whole of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, but it does touch Chile and the Argentinian Patagonia, where many indigenous tribes used to live. Unfortunately, many have been exterminated after the conquests, and there have been massacres of entire indigenous tribes. But there are still some belonging to the Mapui in the Chilean or the southern Argentinian Patagonian area. As anthropologists have explained, there are still a few, which is very interesting, both on a social and on a spiritual level. We then go all the way across the sea to reach Tasmania, which is an island at the bottom of Australia, and New Zealand. So these are tribes, very ancient tribes. So to go through all of the parallel 42 is a bit long, but what we can say is that all of the currents are important, and this is just an example of all of the sacred places that it touches. So this particular parallel is a very special one within all the parallels. Why, one might ask? Why parallel 42? And does this happen only on planet Earth? No. There are many astronomers and geologists that have found that there are other planets that carry an extra energetic charge other than the one that they receive from the Sun. And this is particularly found within those planets that are found at this height of the parallel 42. This parallel 42 is reached by inscribing within a circle or a more or less circular planet a perfect equilateral triangle. And the vertices of this triangle correspond to this parallel 42. And where these lines meet, where they cross over, it is where there is this extra energy which is received by the influence of other planets, constellations. And that is how these important points are found, such as on planet Earth, the parallel 42 corresponds with the Camino of Santiago. So secondly, is the Camino of Santiago something to do with the Christian tradition? Well, no, actually. This dates to way before that, and there are many testimonies by the famous Celts, the Druids. There are testimonies that people used to perform pilgrimage to those lands, which today corresponds to Galicia in the northeast of Spain. So these pilgrimages go back as far as at least 5,000 years ago. There are writings in wooden tables, clay tables, etc., etc. So people used to pilgrim these lands way before Christianity. Why? Because there were these currents which were visible and perceptible to some. There were places of power, of force, as some used to call them. There is such power and such an energetic field where some of these lines crosses that many people used to seek these points in order to activate the consciousness, for healing, for a work of transformation. And so they used to make pilgrimage, not just to Santiago, but to Adelphi and many other parts of the world that have to do with very, very ancient times, and therefore they're not connected to a specific culture. or spiritual tradition. Another very beautiful part of the Camino, if any of you have done it, is nighttime. So pilgrims usually get up very early, especially because if you're doing the Camino in the summer, there is a tremendous heat, especially around the mid part of Spain. And so pilgrims get up very early before dawn, and you basically walk a part of the Camino during the night. And the beautiful thing is that you are basically walking under the Milky Way. So there is a part which is about 900 kilometers, which you're walking, and you constantly see above your head the Milky Way. So that white part that we can see in the sky when we escape the city lights is basically a reflection of the Camino of Santiago. It's a projection of the Camino on the planet Earth. So basically they have modeled the Camino of Santiago to the stars, to the Milky Way. And it is in fact called Santiago de Compostela, which means the walk of the stars, the trail of the stars. So it's absolutely beautiful to walk apart during the night, and the only light that you can see is that of the stars. What we see in the Milky Way is basically only a perspective of our galaxy. It's only a small part that is visible from our point on planet Earth. So from our point of view on planet Earth, our galaxy is this Milky Way, which is a gathering of thousands of stars and celestial doors. And this is the Milky Way, and the Camino of Santiago is basically walking under the Milky Way, which is amazing. And 900 kilometers this way, you realize that it was intentionally done. It's not a coincidence. Another detail that I would like to highlight of the Camino of Santiago is that it is a trail towards the west, that it begins in the east. It's not the only pilgrimage that exists towards the west. So what do all these trails towards the west mean? Well, the west is where the sun sets, so what they indicate is a need for transformation, a death, which is called in many spiritual practices, including Gnosis, a psychological death within one's subconsciousness, to free the consciousness and be able to truly live, to be alive not only within the body but as a person, to be awake as a consciousness. Because one can feel he exists, but without being awake. So without being truly alive with his own consciousness. So he performs mechanical actions as repetitions, just as he did during his previous lives. It's just a succession of repeated events. As an automaton, and this cannot be called life. So many roads towards the west, just as I am remembering the road of the death, in Mexico, in Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, these are roads that invite a person to an internal death and to find truth within one's own being. Life within one's own consciousness, which is trapped within the subconsciousness. So Santiago, which is a trail, and more than a trail, is basically a walk towards one's own death. They say that the apostle Santiago, or St. James, only carried a book for this trail. So he was accompanied by one book that he read at different parts along the trail. It was the book written by his brother, John. So it's the last book of the Bible, which is called the Apocalypse, which means revelation in Greek. So the apocalypse, as we contemplate it as devastation, as destruction, in reality is not just that, it's not just physical, it's about an internal devastation, a process of intimate transformation, a process of internal transformation in order to enter the New Jerusalem, meaning a new state of consciousness. So James the Apostle, brother of John the Apostle, only carried this book with him, the Apocalypse, to indicate, if it wasn't clear enough already, that to take a road towards the west refers to this transformation, that the trail, the walk of Santiago, is an inner walk, an inner work, and it is a complete transformation of the subconsciousness and the unconsciousness. We also have Adelphi, which is a very important pilgrimage towards the west in Greece. Okay, even having said all of this, one may still believe that the Camino of Santiago may be something related to our Christian European culture, etc., etc. But in fact, all it takes is to do a little bit of research of how Santiago actually reached this part of Spain, and also how his body was discovered, because all of this is full of symbolism, which goes way beyond the Christian tradition. So I am going to summarize this. Santiago, or James, was the first apostle to be sacrificed to become a martyr. So Santiago goes to Spain a first time in order to evangelize, but he then returns to Jerusalem due to the first congress between the apostles, and that when he gets caught and decapitated, so he's the first to be killed, more or less during the year 44. So he gets decapitated, and then his body is abandoned by the Romans and is left to rot and for the animals to consume the body. So 7 of the apostles recuperate his body and his head, which are separate, and they put him in a boat made of stone. So we begin to understand that all of this has a meaning. It's not something to be read or taken literally. Because a boat made of stone, I don't think that it can float on the seas. So history tells us it is a boat made of stone without sails and without wheel. And that is how he has to cross the Mediterranean, the Strait of Gibraltar, and a great part of the Atlantic Ocean in order to arrive on the coasts of Galicia in Spain. One may imagine this is highly improbable, since a boat made of stone without wheel, without sails, could possibly do such a journey. The story also tells that once the boat reaches Galicia, the body of Santiago fluctuates and exits the boat on its own and rests itself on a stone which softens and takes the shape of a sepulchre, and then that of a shell. Okay, following this, the apostles want to bury him somewhere where it's dignified. And so they lead him towards the internal part of the land. And they say that 2 bulls became domesticated. Of course, we must understand that this is all symbolic. It is not something possible. So it said these 2 bulls become domesticated, and they guide the body to this hill, which becomes lit up. And they consider this to be a sign of the heavens, this light that shines on top of this hill. But that is the right place where the apostles should be buried. All of this is pure alchemy, pure hermetism, pure symbolism, which we can later go into. Let's say that they are all a symbol of internal processes, such as that of fluctuating to make the stone soft. And also James, Santiago, is the patron saint of alchemists. Alchemists were a hermetic group, and we say alchemy was the most developed science of the medieval times. And the patron saint of the alchemists was James or Santiago, because James or Santiago represents the Mercury in alchemy. So what is Mercury? Mercury is nothing other than one's own sexual energy, because sexual energy is not only needed for procreation. It can procreate externally, such as a child, or it can also procreate internally, and that would be a transcendence. All of these telluric currents and the influence of the stars, what would it all be for? Well, it's to receive all of this energy, such as prana, which then accumulates within us in what we call the sexual gonads, within the Mercury. And Chinese medicine also says this. Taoism, it says that the synthesis of our digestion, of everything we eat, we breathe, is in the sexual energy. which is the most precious elixir that we have. So the Mercury, the sexual energy, is all related to the myth of Santiago. And the reason for his decapitation symbolically is because that energy needs to rise all the way to the head, so we decapitate ourselves. Baptism, christening, in Christianity is basically a self-baptism by raising our waters all the way to our heads. And by transmuting and sublimating one's own energy, that's how we soften the stone, the sex. So bisexuality, and again, I'm not talking about Tantra because today's Tantra, unfortunately, has already been deviated. But yes, I am saying that sexual energy has a use that is as physical as internal and spiritual. And this needs to be recognized. So all of these symbols, such as this boat made of stone, the stone representing the sex, James that fluctuates, just like the energy that raises, the bulls that become domesticated, etc., etc., have to do with processes of sublimation of one's own energies. Just in case it's still not clear enough that behind the Camino of Santiago there is all a Hermetic tradition which is not exclusively Catholic, we then need to focus on how his body is found, because this story is often forgotten. So these disciples bury James, then they die, and they are also buried with the Master. But then 8 or 9 centuries go by before the body is found again. And so that coincides with when pilgrimages to Santiago begin to happen again. When one studies about how the body was found, then one understands that there is all a Hermetic science behind that. The story tells about a hermit called Pelagius from Asturias in the north of Spain. He was a hermit, and at night time he saw in that part, which is now Santiago, where the cathedral is now, he used to see some lights, some blue lights that also appeared to be star showers. And they say this is also where the name Santiago de Compostela comes from, which means rain of stars. So this hermit saw this, and so he reported it to the bishop of the time, and we're talking about around 1835, and his name was Theodore. And so this Bishop Theodore wants to corroborate the story, and so they go to what used to be at the time woods, and they see these blue lights, this shower of stars, and that's where they find the sepulchre, with yet another 2 next to it. And so that's how they came to find where James was buried, together with 2 of his other apostles. One was called Tanasi, and I don't remember the other's name. Okay, so if one knows the story, well, it's not that we deny the discovery, but we can see how it has been exploited by political and religious powers of the time. Because during that specific time, so from 780 AC, Spain was invaded by the Arabs, so the Muslims. So for Catholic infidels, this discovery, whether true or not, I will let each one of you make their own mind, but it is undeniable that it has been used for the religious powers by the Bishop Theodore and the king of that region, because Spain was subdivided into reigns, just as Italy was before the unification. So this was used by the king of Asturias to generate within the population an increase in devotion and to encourage a rebellion against who they believed to be invaders. And so the discovery of the Apostles' Sepulchre was used for this reason. So these are the stars that one can still see in the Sepulchre of Santiago. So one of the most common images of James, this one is found inside the Cathedral of Santiago, but there are many along the trail. So it represents him on top of a white horse, killing infidels. So I find it highly unlikely that an apostle of Jesus Christ begins to kill other human beings simply for not being of the same belief. It is absolutely impossible, because if James is a true master, he would never do such a thing. However, that's the story that was told at the time in order to, as we say, galvanize the population against the invaders. So they made up a story about a famous battle, the Battle of Clavijo, which historians have demonstrated it never actually happened. But at the time they invented this story, which takes place allegedly in Clavijo, which is more or less at the beginning of the trail in the province of Rioja. And they say Santiago appeared on this white horse with a sword, killing the Arabs, guiding the Spanish Catholics. The truth that was a historical fact is that the people from the north part of the Spain began a rebellion, and very slowly throughout the centuries the Arabs as well as the Hebrew people were thrown out. And at that point Spain is then unified, and what happens is Catholic kings then start to appear. And so the Catholic religion also becomes the privileged and the preferred religion. So the reason I wanted to tell this story is to show that I am aware that this story is known, even though we know that it was a myth and it's not real. But this takes away absolutely nothing from the Camino of Santiago and from everything that we are going to look at, the message, the teaching that was left thanks to the Camino. So a question would be, if this was made up, then how is it that throughout the Camino we find so many information and hermetic messages? Okay, this is because the people who had money were motivated to promote this trail from a political point of view. And so they made these constructions along the Camino of cathedrals, churches, monasteries, etc., etc. Here I'm talking about the 12th century period, at which point the Cistercian order takes advantage of this appearing of incredible buildings. The Cister order is basically an Orthodox order within the Christian Church. The Order of Cister is an order within Christianity, but it is hermetic and esoteric. And the founder was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is also who inspired the Order of the Templars. So he promoted the constructions of these buildings, which is all fine, but what we will realize is that inside all of these buildings we will discover that there is not only Christian symbology. We can see Hercules' 12 labors, Indian, Egyptian symbolism, Oriental and Northern European symbolism, such as the Celtic traditions or the Vikings, etc., etc., runes, and so forth. So they take on the building of these constructions. However, they then plant their own symbolism within them that only they would be able to recognize. So the Camino of Santiago was not only a pilgrimage, but it was also a school, an initiatic school. There were, of course, those who only treated it as a pilgrimage, those who had a religious view of it, those who did it as a form of exercise, those who did it for the views. But there were then those who were true initiates, who followed an internal path. So they didn't all get to Santiago, but they would start, for example, in a first temple where there would be a symbolism saying or explaining what was required of them. And they would work on themselves internally until they transformed that which was represented in that temple. So until that transformation was over, they wouldn't be able to go forth to the next city. And this was very beautiful because you could basically only move from one city to another if you had reached that state of consciousness. This is very particular, and I'm not sure whether similar things exist anywhere else in the world. So it's very particular. So yes, it's true that the body may have been born in Spain and it was a little bit promoted by political and religious powers. But beyond that, it was thanks to Hermetic schools of the time, of the master constructors of the cathedrals and the lodges, builders of Gothical cathedrals, the Order of the Templars, the Cistercian order, to take advantage of those buildings to leave these messages on stone, because people couldn't write at the time. There was the Inquisition at the time, so everything had to be hermetic, sealed, symbolic, so only they could recognize these symbols. And this is very particular. So as I said earlier, the people from the north were the only ones not to have been evangelized. They were outsiders to that new religion. So in order to assimilate them, the Christian church had to accept many cults and traditions that still existed in the north of Spain. For example, there was a very important Gnostic Priscillian belonging to the 4th century. And we can even say all the northern part of Spain was Priscillian, so they followed Priscillianism. They were not interested in that new Catholic religion. So in order to expand Catholicism, they had to accept many pagan cults and ancestral traditions, which still existed in the north part of Spain. And all of that can be seen in all of the different temples and constructions of the Camino. It was impossible for them to be completely exterminated because otherwise that part of Spain would have just rejected them. Okay, so we're able to see all of that particular symbolism along the Camino. Okay, so we're starting with the caduceus of Mercury. Okay, there are two main purposes to the Camino. So, of course, that part of Spain is very beautiful, and we don't say it just because we are from there. It's because often we meet people and they ask us, oh, you're from Spain, I've been to Spain, I know it, it's beautiful. And that's because they know the beaches of the Mediterranean. And I understand that, but it's as though you go to Italy and you only visit Rimini. Okay, Rimini is beautiful, so is the Adriatic Sea. But just because you are holidaying and visiting the beaches, it doesn't mean you know Italy. So I often recommend traveling north, especially in the summer, because in the south it's very hot and it is very green in the north. It's cool, it's beautiful. So, of course, the Camino of Santiago is also nice because of this. Because even to this day, there is very little cement along the Camino. You find very little that is built up. So out of 900 kilometers, 800 will be woods or roads that haven't been paved. So, of course, it's also beautiful because of this, but not just because of this. The main reason were these telluric lines, these veins of the planet Earth. And not just to recharge oneself, because if I charge myself up and then I lose that energy again, because I don't know how to transmute that mercury, I don't know how to raise that energy through the channels Ida and Pingala, these channels that are found within our bone marrow and that are spoken about within many traditions from the west to the east. So we have three main energetic channels, which in the East are called Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. And as you can see, these take the shape of the very own caduceus of Mercury, which then becomes the symbol for medicine, because that is universal medicine, because he who transmutes his energy heals. He heals his soul above everything. It is the elixir of long life. It's universal medicine. And that's why we use it for the god of medicine. Hermes, Mercury, Thoth, James or Santiago and his brother John. So, okay, many make this walk because they know this about the veins of the earth, so they recharge. So they walk, and they're recharging. But if they don't know how to transmute, they then waste that energy again. It can be wasted through anger, through pride, through many things. One doesn't even know what to do with the sexual energy, and he just wastes it. It seems a bit absurd. Charge, discharge, it's a never ending. So what it's important is to learn how to accumulate and then transmute the energy. And we're certainly not talking about abstinence. To transmute is to raise the mercury. That is the true Camino of Santiago. And it starts, not by coincidence, in the coccyx, which is like a mountain range, like the Pyrenees. And another crazy thing is that the Camino of Santiago has a lot in common with the spinal cord. So the Pyrenees is where the Camino of Santiago begins, which is a mountain range, which is like our coccyx, the sacral bone. And then it develops along 33 vertebrae and 33 degrees of masonry. That's when Freemasonry was a hermetic school, but it's now changed into something completely different. So the 33 years of Jesus and the Cathedral of Santiago has 33 degrees to enter, etc. So there are 33 vertebrae, which you need to raise the mercury along. So the Camino of Santiago is an inner path, which is what we are inviting you to. A lot of people have called us thinking that we were preparing an itinerary to actually do the Camino of Santiago, and I could hear Lorena answering the phone calls with patience saying, no sir, we're not a travel agency, we're going to talk about the inner Camino of Santiago, because that's all that counts. So of course it's beautiful to do it physically, but if you don't do it internally, it's a real shame. So as I've said before, the alchemy had James as a patron saint. So to have a look at some references, this is supposed to be the stone on which the stone boat hit and came to a halt. We can find the stone in what was called at the times of the Romans Iria Flavia, which today takes the name of the city of Padron. So this stone is found holding up an altar in a Catholic church, and it is engraved, but as we can see, it has a phallic shape, a male sexual organ, and when you see it in person, this is even more obvious. The phallic cults are very popular around the globe, just as the cults to the yoni, which is the female sexual organ. So this is all about alchemy, one's own work with his own sexual energy. There are thousands of alchemic symbols that depict the work in the laboratory. I'm not talking about Spagyria. So the alchemists didn't have a chemistry lab. That is a deviation. The true lab is within our own body. Everything is already within us, but we need to learn how to use it. We need to know how to use it. So we're talking about the work as a single person or as a couple with one's own sexual energy in order to raise this. Initially along these two channels, which are parallel and twist on each other along the spinal cord, which we call Ida and Pingala, and this process eventually brings us to the famous awakening of the Kundalini. And from that moment onwards, the sacred Kundalini raises along the middle spinal channel called the Sushumna. So these are not physical channels. A surgeon wouldn't be able to find these. What we're talking is about the energetic field of our body, so our energetic body. These don't only go along the physical body, because within our body we have many other bodies, many levels, many parts of our being. And this energy needs to be conducted to all the parts that are, for example, represented in the Kabbalistic tradition of the Tree of Life, which synthesizes the 10 most important parts of our being. And so this energy needs to take in through body to body, from the physical body to the energetic body, to the astral body, to the mental body, to the body of will, to the body of consciousness, to the body of pure spirit, etc., etc. All of these are parts within us which we're not aware of. What a shame that we may think we only have this physical body and that only a physical life exists. So at the moment I have been speaking more about the sexual energy, but I will also speak about the consciousness which we need to free. And as we continue along the psychological work, we free the consciousness inside of us. Okay, this is the image of Mercury of Giambologna, which is one of the most beautiful images that exist of the god Mercury, which is here in Florence. Because as you will know, the Renaissance is inspired to Hermetic traditions. So Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, who were two initiates, because not everybody that participated in the Neoplatonic Academy were masters, but Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, yes. And they were also translators of the classical work, such as the Corpus Hermeticum of Hermes Trismegistus, which was actually what we did our public talk on last year here, the 7 Universal Principles of Hermes Trismegistus, where we also honored Marsilio Ficino because he was the official translator here in Florence from the Medici family, and he was assigned to translate these works from Greek and Latin. And that's where all of the Neoplatonic Hermetic tradition in Florence was inspired from. And we then have the Renaissance period, which is full of esoteric symbolism. And most of the main artists of the time link themselves to these Hermetic schools, such as Leonardo and many other masters of the Renaissance. We can also see this symbolism in what is the clothing of the pilgrim. What is striking, first of all, is the stick, the staff. On top of the staff, there is a gourd, which served as a water bottle to carry water. And there's also the cape. Next, we can see a picture of James with the symbol of a shell, which he had on his hat and on his cape. So the staff obviously represents the spinal cord along which the Mercury, the sexual energy, needs to raise. It has to be raised all the way up, where we have the gourd, and the gourd represents repentance. The elemental of the pumpkin or the gourd, which is its consciousness, because everything that has life has consciousness, basically represents transformation of people. And within that gourd, what accumulates is water, Mercury, and it's at the same height as one's head, because that's where we need to raise the energy to, like baptism. And then one day, the shell will be able to flourish, which we also know the symbolism through the Venus of Botticelli, the birth of Venus, so it's associated to Venus. And love, so it's what allows us to reach the conquest of love. And we're not just talking about human love, but divine love. So the Venus of Botticelli is born from a shell. And the symbol that you had done the Camino of Santiago is that you reach the sea. If you have done this, you will know that the Camino of Santiago doesn't end of Santiago. You have to go back on yourself until you reach a place called Finisterre, which is on the sea. So from Santiago to Finisterre, it's about a 3-day walk. So it's not too much. It's about 90 or 80 kilometers. But that is truly where the Camino ends. Of course, Santiago of Compostela is an important landmark of the Camino, but it truly ends in the ocean of Finisterre. So the sign at the time that you had ended or completed the walk was that you carried a conch, a shell, around your neck, and this was a symbol that you had reached the Atlantic Ocean. So some shells, as we know, produce pearls, and pearls are associated to Venus, or Aphrodites, Hermes and Aphrodites, hermaphrodite, which is the conquest of our real being, which is father, mother, it's man, woman. It's all inside of us. It's androgynous. So we're talking about accumulating Hermes, which is the sexual energy, and Aphrodite, love, for the awakening of consciousness. And this is what we are offering. So this is the famous shell of Santiago, which people can buy now in souvenir shops. You can even get golden ones to hang on the wall. Okay, so to end to the introduction, which seems a bit long, but it is necessary even to just understand the title, which is the Initiatic path. So I would like to end by explaining about the French doctor who was Amérique Picot, who stipulated what is today the French part of the Camino of Santiago. So during the 13th century, many pilgrims took different routes. The trail is only one because it follows this parallel 42, this telluric line. But those who didn't know about it, they would leave from whichever part of Spain and Europe and do whichever route was more convenient. So the one to stipulate which was the true Camino was this French doctor Amérique Picot, who came up with what we know as the Codex Calixtinus, because Calixtinus was the Pope of the time. So the important thing of when you take this Codex Calixtinus then is to see that the Camino of Santiago is divided into 13 parts. So technically you should do the Camino in 13 days, which is impossible because there are 900 kilometers, which would mean walking 80 kilometers every day for 13 days, which is impossible. So even here we get the idea of the symbolism. So there are 13 stages because the number 13 in numerology represents death, which relates to what I spoke about at the beginning. So a walk towards the west, to die in order to find a life, the death of the subconsciousness in order to free the consciousness. So here we see this repetition of symbolism. So 900 kilometers in 30 days, 70 kilometers a day. So to those who rush it, I say you don't really get to enjoy it. I mean, there are people who do it in 30 days because they have 30 days of holidays, and so they do 900 kilometers, 30 kilometers a day. And I say it's better to take 2 states and do it slowly, not as a race, the race of Italy, an Olympic marathon. So they run, and they don't stop to contemplate, they don't stop to meditate, they don't stop to look or study the symbolism, and so it becomes a sport to do 30 kilometers without stopping and meditating every part of it. I've done it, and most of these images that you see were taken by us, and the way I did it was 2 places a day. So of course we didn't take 30 days to do it, but at the time we also lived nearby and we opened a Gnostic school nearby. So we moved and we did it across many years. So every day we would visit 1 or 2 of those places, study the symbolism, meditate it and transform it, bringing it to the consciousness. So you can do 15 or 20 kilometers, which doesn't seem like much, but it is definitely worth it to sit along those telluric lines, study the symbolism, do different meditation practices. Okay, to finish with this introduction and explanation on what the Camino is, I'm going to read something from Fulcanelli, an alchemist, master not of the medieval times, but only of the last century. He was a nuclear physicist, but he is an initiated master, and he has completed what in alchemy we call the great work. So he has finished this inner work, fused with his being. So I'm going to read The Dwellings of the Philosophers by Fulcanelli. And in volume 1, this is what he says on the Camino of Santiago. All alchemists should undertake this pilgrimage. It is a symbolic journey, not physical. And he who wants to take advantage of this cannot for even 1 instant abandon his laboratory, so the work on himself. He must continuously keep guard of the vase, of the matter, of the fire, which I have explained as the mercury or the sexual energy, which is also referred to as the vase of Hermes. One must also be on the go, Compostela, an emblematic city which is not situated on Spanish soil, but on the soil of the philosophical subject, meaning inside of each one of us. The walk is rough, full of unforeseen dangers, and it is a long and tiring road. It's where the potential becomes actual and the occult becomes manifest. This is the delicate preparation of the first matter, the common mercury that the sages have hidden under the allegory of the pilgrimage of Compostela. Okay, let's finish the chapter. So, the Camino of Santiago begins with 22 stages. There is kind of a division because you can either begin at Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port or at Saint-Port, which are two ports in the Pyrenees. There are two different roads which then meet and join together in a city called Puente de Reina. So this is already symbolic that you begin with two roads. They represent two things. First of all, the two channels which we have spoken about, Ida and Pingala, which then join together into one channel, Sushumna, along which the Kundalini rises. And it also represents the fact that we have to go beyond the dualism of the mind. We are victims of a dualist mind. We are victims of many things of the mind, such as preoccupations, problems, obsessions. The mind is a tool that we need to transform. It's not a negative thing, it's just that it is abused by the subconsciousness, with us having such little consciousness. And so we have to put up with the temporary personality. We don't have enough consciousness for our mind, our personality to obey us, because it is the consciousness that guides these vehicles. So if we don't have the consciousness awake, we are just victims of problems, preoccupations. And so these two roads represent exactly that dualism that we need to overcome. And whether someone is tall, short, sick, healthy, man, woman, all of these are basically mental forms. Whether you're Italian or Spanish, all of these are constructs of the mind. Because in reality, we are all beings. We are all the same. There is no difference between old, young. They're all temporary things that pass, tricks of the mental forms that we have. So if one wants to start a true process of awakening, he needs to learn how to transform and overcome many of these tricks of the mind. And not just as concepts, because it's easy to agree with this and to understand it. But it's not a mental concept that is above any other mental concept. It is a transformation through the consciousness of the dualism of the mind. Okay, so there are two trails at the beginning. So we start with the Navarro walk because it goes through that region that is called Navarra. This is where Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port begins, which is in the Pyrenees, still in the French part. We then reach the first city of the Spanish Pyrenees, which is called Roncesvalles. Of course, I've had to choose the most significant places because to go through all of them is impossible. So in Roncesvalles, there is this symbol which represents a very important battle, which tells of this king, and this is his sword, this king who fought against a giant like Goliath, who kept those regions terrified. And what that giant represents is what Hermetism talks about as the guardian of the threshold, which is basically the shadow of our subconsciousness that through fear prevents us from even beginning a true path of change. It tells us it's better to just not go there, to remain within security, within our false security. Why should one change? Change might mean things will go worse than they're going now. So fear, which is one of the aspects of the guardian of the threshold, is this giant, this Goliath, which basically is fought at the beginning of the path against this king at Roncesvalles, and it reminds us which is the first thing that we have to do, which is to transform this giant, which is the shadow of the subconscious within us. Of course, it is going to oppose itself to an inner work, because the subconscious is happy that way. It takes advantage of us. It feels for us. It thinks for us. It uses our mind, our feeling, our energy. The subconscious is a parasite that lives of us. But if one's aware of this and he is not happy, he fights against it. I fight against this. I fight to discover who I truly am, and I don't just live a life of fantasy. And I don't just imitate or repeat things due to all the conditioning psychological factors and errors. So the first battle is actually against the projection, not even directly against the I, the aggregates as we call them in Gnosis, but the shadow of the I, which is called the guardian of the threshold, which is presented here as the first stage, the first town, the fight against this giant. And no matter how big this giant is, if you truly call upon your being, your consciousness, it cannot win because love always wins. The consciousness is of higher value. It is light that hides the darkness. The thing is, we need to know how to enter in contact with our consciousness, and we shouldn't fear. In fact, it is it that should fear. It is the darkness that should fear us. Okay, going forward, we reach a town called Pamplona. Pamplona is particular because there are not your traditional Christian symbols. It's the esoteric Christianism that we're talking about. And during the first centuries of Christianism, it was an esoteric, initiatic Christianism. It later became the state church and the Universal Catholic Church, and it's something completely different, which of course we do respect, but we have to say that it has distanced itself from an inner work. It became a cult, the state religion. So there will be Christian symbols, but more so the esoteric Christianism. Typically, we have mythological signs, such as in one of the capitals, where we can see an eagle with a unicorn. The photo has been cut, but it's not a horse. You can see there is a unicorn. So the unicorn joined together with the eagle is a fantastic symbol, because the eagle is the spiritual elevation. It is the maximum level of consciousness. It is the being also. And the unicorn is the symbol of the complete transformation of the Mercury. So it's a completed work, the energetic and the psychological part fused together. So it's like a message. This is what we want to achieve. Now that we have begun the journey, because we're still in the first stages when we see this. In the courtyard of this church or this monastery in Pamplona, there is also another beautiful symbol on another capital, which is a dragon. So again, a mythological symbol. And it's a dragon with a closed book. What it means is that you need to defeat the dragon in order to open the book, to read the book of knowledge. So the book is inside of us. All of the knowledge is contained inside of us. So we have heard this many times, but normally we don't know where to look for it. Or one may have tried to meditate, but only finds confusion and he doesn't know what to do. So sometimes he just says, I can't do it. Where is this knowledge? They tricked me. But one needs to learn how to open the book. So the dragon is the subconsciousness. But we have to fight it like Saint George against the dragon. We have to transform the subconscious into conscious. And at that point, the consciousness then reveals what is already knowledge inside of you. And you then have access to this book of knowledge. Okay, towards this trail, which is called the Navarro, we then reach the Reina Bridge, which is the town where the two trails meet. So we'll later come back to this Puente la Reina. Okay, this is the main church in the town, and inside of the church we have this. So we are in the Basque country at this point, where they speak Basque and not Spanish. And this is referred to as Santiago Beltza. Beltza means black in Basque. So a black Santiago, because the symbolism of alchemists was also expressed through colors. So each one of us, when we begin the journey, we have a coarse sexual energy, Mercury, because we've never known how to transmute. And so it carries this color. So it was black. And then when one would begin to transform, it would turn white and then yellow. And as the last color, it turns red. Represents the red of the fire of the Kundalini. So black, white, yellow and red. So this Santiago Belza is a medieval piece. His origins date back to the 12th or 13th century, when the majority of the Initiatic path was built up with churches. So Santiago Belza is here to represent the state of the Mercury and the consciousness at this beginning stage of the path. We are still in darkness, we are still very unconscious. So his name is Santiago to obviously represent the Camino of Santiago, but he's dark, his skin is black. And along the path we can also find many black virgins. And the Catholic Church explains this by saying that it was the smoke of the fire or something. They think that we are stupid. It has nothing to do with the smoke of candles. It is a black wood that they use. They were built this way, but of course they don't want to recognize that there was an alchemical tradition with all these meanings. So yes, along the path we can find many black virgins, like the Virgin of Loreto in Italy and many other parts of the world. Okay, so we are still at Puente la Reina, which is a meaningful spot because it's where these two paths meet and join and then become a unique path. In this same church, we can find this crucifix that, as you can see, is very particular. So it doesn't have your traditional cross shape, but this is an esoteric symbol. So it's not the Latin cross, but it is called the goosefoot shape, because if you look at it closely, the shape reminds us of a goosefoot. And the goosefoot was an initiatic symbol because it's what initiates along the Camino used to use to recognize and differentiate themselves from simple pilgrims. So either as a brooch or in some other way, they used to carry this symbol so that they would recognize one another. And that would invite them to stop and talk to each other using other language. So it was a symbol amongst those who used to enter these initiatic schools, and they led that kind of life by working on themselves. And here we can see the link between these shapes with that goosefoot. And for those who are also familiar with the Nordic runes, so in the north of Europe in very ancient times, this runic tradition was born. And one of the most famous runes is this one on the right, which is called the Laugh Man. And then we have the goosefoot, because the goose or the rooster are very important symbols. You can find along the Camino many dead roosters that resuscitate, that sing, because the rooster is still a symbol of the Mercury, that which in the Christian world they call the Holy Spirit, which brings you back to life because he sings at dawn when the sun comes up. So it represents the intimate Christ, and that is why a goose or a rooster are used as symbols. And there are also many stories along the Camino about these roosters that died, then would come back to life and sing, because it's to recuperate the verb, the word, to find the lost word. Okay, so let's go back to the other path. So, as I had said, there were two paths that started at the Pyrenees and they then joined together at Puente la Reina. So we have done the superior part, which is called the Navarro Camino. I didn't stop very long here because I much prefer the Aragon Camino. And it's the one that the least people take. And those who only do the Camino once usually choose the other, which is a shame because, first of all, they're all equally beautiful. But today, the superior part of it is more industrialized, so you go through many more cities. So it's much more original, and you also enjoy nature a lot more if you do the Aragon side, which still starts at the Pyrenees, at Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. Okay, in this image, you can see the two main channels, Ida and Pingala, which originate at the coccyx, or the sacral area. And why is it called sacral? Because that's where there is a sacred energy, where the Kundalini lays, which needs to be awoken, at which point we open many nadis, many chakras. Okay, each has their own opinion. Obviously, we are here to share ours. So the way to reveal the Divine Mother, as we call her, the eternal feminine, because she is like a mother that brings you to life, to a new life, a spiritual life, is through a work that is done through three factors. Three are the principal parts. And here I will take a short break so that I can explain this without only speaking about symbolism. Eternal gnosis, which is not our gnosis, it is a syncretism of all religions, has synthesized the inner work into three principles: death, birth, and sacrifice, or if you prefer, death, birth, and unconditional disinterested love. What death refers to is through meditation to enter in contact with one's consciousness, to study the subconsciousness, to see one's own tricks, one's own ideals, fantasies, which I mentioned earlier, and this is a fundamental part. Otherwise, I cannot free my consciousness, which is trapped within many psychological aggregates, conditioners of all types. The Mayans called it the flourishing war. We call it the psychological death. The Tibetan Buddhists called it the disintegration, annihilation. Free the consciousness which is trapped within the conditions of the subconsciousness. The second part, which is the birth, is what we spoke about, the sexual energy. So to sublimate, to elevate the Mercury along these channels in order to generate internal spiritual bodies. And as I've said, just as one can create a physical child, one can create the alchemical golden child. That is to say, the bodies for the being, the bodies the being needs to incarnate within. So we don't have this idea of this unreachable God somewhere that I need to reach. You incarnate your very own being. It is the being that incarnates here, within matter, within your bodies, that of course you first have to create through the sexual energy, or the birth, which Jesus used to refer to as the second birth. And we then have a third factor, which is compassion or disinterested love, through the sacrifice for humanity. So the death is to transform darkness into light. The birth is needed in order to know how to accumulate that energy within those internal bodies. And love, or sacrifice for humanity, is in order to expand and give it to others. Because otherwise you become selfish, you cannot complete the path. If you just think about yourself and you do not share that with others, or you do not help others to awaken. So when we talk about practice, any practice is not enough. And I don't say this as my own opinion. We are anthropologists, and we've been teaching this for over 30 years. We have studied the most important spiritual traditions of the world. We have found these common principles that are related to all the original traditions. Then, of course, through centuries, because of different cultures, they may be expressed in a way or another. But they were there. The fact that then they become religions and they become polluted is something else. But at the origin, for every tradition, these principles exist, which we call the three factors for the revolution of the consciousness. They were also named this by the contemporary founder of Gnosis, that to us, well, he's our master. And we say our because he doesn't necessarily have to be yours. We do not sell masters. However, he is the founder of contemporary Gnosis, S.A.W, who was seen in the initial photos, him and his wife, the master Litelantes, they also carried out this work of syncretism of all traditions. And that's where we also see these three principles. So to practice, of course, it is necessary to practice, because without practice, they cannot be changed. However, any practice is not enough. That's not just according to us, but as I've said, also to all the other traditions. If there are not these three concrete aspects of the work, then we cannot reach a true state of awakening. To practice just to practice is not enough. If a practice does not lead me to a contact with my consciousness, then it won't produce the fruit that the practice is meant to produce. I can be working with the I that observes the I, the subconscious that observes the subconscious, the mind itself that studies the mind, and I don't resolve anything this way. I just complicate things for myself because I can become a mythomaniac. I believe myself to be a mystic, to be someone without actually going through a true process of awakening. So the practice then cannot just be any practice. It needs to have a starting point, and it has to be the contact with the consciousness. Otherwise, there will not be the benefit that the person who is doing the practice is seeking. So since we are already here, we want to clarify that the meditation, so the meditation that we also practice during the course, well, I hear many people saying, I meditate. Okay, that's great. But then when I listen to this person, they meditate 5-15 minutes. And you have to forgive me, but that is not meditating. That is barely relaxation. So true meditation has different stages. The first of that stage is relaxation, which can last about 15 minutes. But a meditation has to be at the very least an hour for it to begin to be classed as a meditation. So I don't want you to be afraid, because what we do is at the beginning we don't go for an hour. We teach everybody from the very beginning, stage by stage, in order to have as a goal one day to not just be guided by me, but to be able to meditate by yourselves, just as much as putting into practice other disciplines, other types of practice. So the Aragon part of the path, starting at Somport, which is another part of the Pyrenees. Following here, we then reach a city called Jaca, which is very important. If we were just to explain this church in Jaca, it would take us hours due to all the symbolism it contains. So in order for you to understand the importance of this place, I will tell you this. They say that for a century and a half, this is the church where the sacred Grail was kept. And in fact, we can see engraved in one of the columns the map of the church, the blueprint, which has the shape of a key. So it means in this place, the key was taught, which represents the Holy Grail, which is the vase or glass of Hermes, which is the cult to the feminine. Just as the phallus was important, like we saw in the phallic cults that we spoke about, also the female sexual organ is very important, which is represented in Christianism through the Holy Grail, or the Celtic cauldron, etc. So the knowledge of these alchemical principles is a key to the mysteries which were taught in this very place. So this is where the Holy Grail was kept for a century and a half. So on the tympanum at the entrance, we can see this image, which is full of symbolism. And this is why Jaca is so important. So there are two lions, and the lion is a symbol of the fire. And the fire is connected to the Kundalini, which we've spoken about. On the right side, we can see a man, which is battling a snake. And it is thanks to that he's being protected by a lion. But when instead the fire is poisoned and you use your sexuality simply for physical satisfaction of the senses, you completely ignore the fact that spiritual principles allows you to connect to your spiritual part. At that point, you're completely devoured by the poisonous snake and the animal passion. But the depicted man is overcoming the serpent, and therefore he's assisted by the lion. Whereas the lion on the left is holding a bear. Even though it's small, it is a bear. The light isn't great, but we can see it is a small bear that was intentionally indicated to show that the bear is a symbol of violence, of destruction of the whole of our ego. So we lose that strength. That's why the bear is so small. It barely looks like a small pig compared to the Kundalini fire or the lion. In the center, there is a big rose, which looks like a chakra, and it looks like Oriental symbolism. It contains 8 flowers, 7 of which have 10 petals, and one of them has 11 petals, so that's a sum of 81 petals. And if we sum up the 8 and the 1, then we get the 9, and the 9 is the number of the Initiatic path. The number 9 refers to the 9th sphere. And as we are in Florence, we can also mention Dante, who describes the 9 circles of hell. And in order to exit these 9 circles, you have to start and complete the path. So 9, the path. So the meaning of this number 9 is represented in the sum of these petals. And for those who know a little bit about Oriental symbolism, it represents the fact that we need to exit the wheel of samsara. The wheel of samsara represents mechanical existence, so birth, death, positive karma, negative karma. So it's to never resolve, to never liberate oneself from creation, of the repetition of birth and death, a life with a bit better karma, a life with a bit worse karma, suffering. So that repeated suffering is what causes a soul to become tired. So yes, to say this again, this definitely looks like an Oriental symbol, the wheel of samsara. And all of this is possible if we polarize well with the lion, with the Kundalini fire.
Continuando per questo cammino aragonese, arriviamo a un posto che non si trova proprio sul cammino, perché questo così vi dico un'altra cosa.
Okay, so continuing on this Aragon path, we get to a place that is not really on the Camino. So basically on the Camino there are some very beautiful places. But sometimes they would create some parallel places, like maybe 5 kilometers away. Okay, this one in the picture is a bit further, as it's about 15 kilometers off the path. So they used to create these places off the path, which used to be even more important and more sacred, because it's where the true initiates lived and learned. Because in the end, the official Camino was walked by many, but many didn't really live it. They just did it in a Catholic way as penance or to pray to the apostle, etc., etc. So all of these parallel places were even more secret. So I wanted to show you this because apart from the fact that it is beautiful, it is called San Juan de la Peña, so Saint John of the Stone, and the name is already very significant, and we can see the huge mass, the huge stone that covers the town. It is a very beautiful place, isolated within nature. If we look at other pictures, we can see close up how the stone even covers a kind of church. So some places are actually built within the stone as a cave. And here they also say that you could find the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail did move through different places in order for it not to be found, etc. So it also spent some time here. The next thing you can see is an oven, because one of the symbols of alchemy is the oven, or how they used to call it, atanor. Atonor is the oven and Atanor is the woman. So you have to enter the oven in order to be baked. And a symbol that they used to use was to bake the loaf of bread, which actually comes from an Egyptian cult to Osiris and Ra. One of the main Egyptian cults was to offer the 7 breads to Osiris and Ra. So one had to know how to bake the 7 breads, the 7 loaves, which actually represent the 7 bodies: physical, energetic, astral, mental, etc. And this can be generated by transmuting the sexual energy and by uniting the lingam yoni. And that fire, that oven, is the fire belonging to the man and woman. And you can see this monastery has the exact shape of an Atanor. This is the courtyard where there are 33 arches, as I remember. So the number 33, which I've already spoken about. We can also see 3 altars, number 3, which represents creation, because the union of man and woman is love. Man, woman, and divine love creates something superior, while man, woman, and passion create something inferior. So you can then choose to either liberate the consciousness or to trap yourself within it. It depends on how you use this energy. Okay, this is a replica of the Holy Grail. This isn't it. It's just here to represent that it's been here. Okay, carrying on, we reach Melide, which is a beautiful town by a big lake. Melide sounds a little bit like Eire, which means Ireland, because all of the symbolism from this monastery or church is Celtic, Druidic. Because it was an Irish order, and it's because the Initiatic constructor lodges in all of Europe were mainly 3. So one of them was originally from the north of England and Ireland, and this is known due to the symbolism and the chronicles which tells us about this, that these builders basically came from there, and that's why the town's name, Melide, reminds us of Ireland. So in one of the capitals, for example, we find Siegfried, which is one of the most famous traditions of the Northern Europe. And the myth of Siegfried is also told by the Celtic tradition. So Siegfried is a hero, like Hercules, Parsifal, etc., who kills a dragon by putting a sword through its abdomen. And what comes out of that abdomen are precious stones, gold, etc., etc. So that's the symbol of the kind of work that we need to do, which is basically to slay the dragon, penetrate through the subconsciousness, in order to reveal the inner values of the consciousness. So here, depicted, there is the story of Siegfried and the dragon, and the moral is to not allow the snake to bite us. In this other capital, we have 2 horns which belong to a Viking, and this Viking is inhaling through its nose 2 alchemical vials, because the sexual energy that we've discussed in relation to Santiago has a direct relation to the breath, to the inhalation, to the pranayama. So at the root of the nose is where these 2 channels that I spoke about conjoin. And there are some breathing exercises that we teach in order to raise the energy through these 2 channels. These 2 channels, which are bones from the ovaries and the testes, and then conjoin at the root of the nose. Where here they also create a singular channel called Andrita, which leads to the heart. So these Vikings are trying to teach us transmutation through the 2 channels of the nose, by inhaling the vial of mercury. So it's all Northern European symbolism. We then reach a point which deeply fascinates me and Lorena, which is after my city, where we often go. But then another place which we often visit is Eunate. And if you ever visit Northern Europe, I really recommend that you visit this place, Eunate. Because imagine this is the place by which we have already walked 150 kilometers. So it means that the person that reaches this point would have already worked on oneself. They will have freed a good amount of consciousness. They will have transformed their energy. They would have accepted all of this work. And it is exactly here where they were taught the great mystery of the Arcanum, the big secret, the Initiatic ritual. This Initiatic ritual used to be lived at night time, and I have been lucky enough to be here at night time. And this temple is made of alabaster. And what happens is that the light of the stars and the moon passes through the alabaster, and you see inside it all lights up with a blue light, which is a beautiful thing to see. And also the alabaster is a very powerful stone. So on the inside it's octagonal. It was built by the Templars, and if you've noticed, all of the octagonal builds were built in that period, and they belong to the Templars of the time, of course, not the modern Templars, because the Templars of the time were one of the many Gnostic currents which contained those three factors, and the contemporary Templars do not teach you those principles. Therefore, they're not Templars, I'm sorry. That happens with all traditions. It will also happen with us and our teaching, because if nobody lives it, then it will end up deviating. And so eternal gnosis will need to appear again under a different name. So in this Templar place, one of the famous Templar symbols is the Baphomet, which you can see here, and here it has been deeply misinterpreted due to the church, accusing them to adore the devil. And this is not the devil, this is the Templar Baphomet. And if Baphomet is read from back to front, in Latin it means the temple of your inner father. So it was in fact a cult to one's own inner father. But unfortunately its shape has led to fear and ignorance. Okay, this is another important spot, which is only 2 kilometers away from Puente la Reina, where the two paths join. And there you used to be given special teachings which you needed for the inner work. Why were these teachings secret in the past? It was not to desecrate them. And at this point they knew that you had already done a great part of the interior work, so it wouldn't be undervalued, desecrated. Okay, so we've reached the conjoinment of the two paths and spoken about the point of Puente la Reina. So we are now on the one unique path, and we're going to stop at certain landmarks. This is called Estrella, which means star, and it is a particular church. As you can see, the two serpents look a bit like Ida and Pingala that then come to join in one point. This is part of a staircase that heads towards the altar, and it is full of this kind of symbolism. And this is in the courtyard, and as you can see, the columns themselves are twisted upon themselves, which is fantastic. So I used to be an architect before I became a Gnostic teacher. So even from an architectural point of view, this is very fascinating, the columns. Then there is the killing of the dragon, which represents the subconscious. So next we have the altar, where that initial staircase that we saw leads to. And here we have a Madonna, a Virgin, which is basically the Christian representative of the Divine Mother Kundalini. And as you can see here, there are the 3 channels twisted upon themselves, just like inside of us. And I know all of this sounds repetitive, but these are stages that you have to live over and over again on the path. Because as I have explained, the main bodies are 7. There are 7 main dimensions of nature. So they are processes that keep repeating themselves every time at higher or superior octaves or degrees. Here we then reach another town, which is called Santo Domingo de la Calzada. So it's a particular tribute because inside there is a rooster and some chickens, and not only symbolic, but real. So it's particular that as you come into the church, there is this cage with the rooster and that sings and chickens. So it's all clearly paganism. And this is one of those ancestral rituals that the Catholic Church had to accept and integrate in this part of Spain. And so when you're inside this church, you hear the chickens making noises, the rooster singing. And there is a story that tells about a king that didn't believe in any of this. And for lunch, he was served a rooster. And that rooster on the plate that was fully cooked just comes to life. So obviously it's referring to alchemical processes of transformation and the message to know how to live the process of death and inner resurrection. And the rooster has a colorful plumage, many colors, which represents the many different qualities and powers of our being. That's why it's used as a symbol. And then it is also used as a symbol of Portugal, because geographically we are there in the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, this is Saint Domingo, and the story tells that the infidels used to use this as a symbol because they cut his head off, they decapitated him, because he was teaching, he was evangelizing, etc. But the story tells that even with his head under his arm, he continued to teach. So it's a symbol that with the decapitation of the ego, quite the opposite, they're not able to stop your verb. And it's actually now that you teach what counts. Okay, we then reach Burgos, which is a big city, it's a capital. So in Burgos, the rose window, which is very large and it resembles Santa Croce in Florence. There is a 6-pointed star in the center, which is referred to or known as David's Star, or the Star of David, the flag of Israel, etc. But the 6-pointed star is a purely alchemical symbol, because there are 2 triangles that cross one another in opposite directions, which represent the soul and the spirit that cross together, or the mercury and the sulfur that come together, which is alchemical language. Quite technical, but we've already spoken about the mercury, which is the sexual energy. But sulfur represents the libido. So when one is able to transform the energy and the libido, a moment comes within you that this work undergoes constant sublimations. And then that's when the Kundalini awakens. So Burgos in the Camino of Santiago represents the moment in where a man or a woman awakens the sacred Kundalini. It took a while, 200 kilometers, more or less, to reach Burgos. And there is what we call the probatory path, with lots of tests along the way. Tests that need to be passed in order to reach that moment of the awakening of the Divine Mother Kundalini, of your psychic anatomy, because it is psychic energy. It's not a woman or a snake, it is psychic energy which holds the power to awaken. She's the goddess Athena of knowledge. The Divine Mother is not just love, but she is knowledge. Yes, she is tender, she is a mother, but she is also knowledge. So this energy begins to awaken within you. And here we are in Burgos with this big rose window as a representation of that moment where the mercury and the sulfur come together, the Star of David. Also, the lateral sides of the church, it's the same thing. You can see these solar discs because we need to create that solar energy, and the cross, which represents the real Christic path. Inside Burgos, there is a Mary Magdalene. I think one day we're going to do a public conference on Mary Magdalene, because as a symbol, she is fantastic. I mean, it has also been used within esoteric Christianism everything that we are now seeing with the symbolism of Santiago. Magdalene is a symbol of repentance. She is a soul that repents and transforms. And so she washes the 7 sins, the 7 demons, and that's why we find her here. Because one who awakens his Kundalini, it's when they start a true path of transformation. In Burgos, while still in the city but on your way out, there is a monastery called the Monasterio de las Huelgas, which has something very particular because there is this Santiago, James, which has got strings attached to him, a bit like a puppet, and he can raise his shoulder because at the time the custom was to kneel and Santiago would lay his sword over your head. And that's why we can find him here, able to move. One of the symbols used in many traditions to represent the Kundalini is in fact the sword. If we can even recall Excalibur and Arthur and the whole search for the sword is the will, the sword is the fire. And so they used to say that to receive this fire of Kundalini, which men couldn't give you, no kings, no priests, because it is a spiritual energy, they said only Santiago could give you this. So even from just a symbolic perspective, the Dome of Burgos represented the awakening of the Kundalini, and only 2 kilometers away there is this monastery where the initiates used to kneel, and this articulated Santiago used to lay his sword over your head to symbolize the receipt of the spiritual fire. So we are now entering Castilla, and up to this point the geology is still very much up and down, valleys, mountains. It's a typical part of northern Spain. But once we pass Burgos, we reach a plain. So this is about 400 kilometers of flat land. And as they say, Castilla is so wide that even something in sight looks like a mirage, because one just keeps seeing very long fields that all look the same, even without trees. So when you do this in the winter, there is a terrible cold wind. If you do it in the summer, you cannot find any shade. And this is done intentionally. So at this point of the Camino, of the path, we go through this part of the initiatic path, which is so hard and harsh, because we have to purify ourselves, not because we are martyrs, but because the fight against oneself is difficult. So even from a geological perspective, all the places that were chosen are fantastic. All of this helps us understand that which at one time used to be lived within people. And that is what we're trying to teach and encourage people to do, not just as information, but as something to truly live. So in these plains of Castilla, in this city that used to be called Frovista, in Fromista, you can find a lot of corbels. We can see this on the right side of the church, but it's the same on the left side. So even this church has a lot of symbolism. All of these corbels are actually teachings, and even the shape as a chessboard and the arches. So the chessboard shape represents that battle between white and black, consciousness against the subconsciousness, light against the inner darkness, etc. So all of these corbels are full of symbolism. There are donkeys, and I think, yes, we get to see one. Here there is a donkey that is playing a harp. Donkey represents the mind, because the mind is like a donkey. It's stubborn, rigid, it doesn't move. You have to kick it for it to do the work. It doesn't want to change. It is rigidity, and it's fixated in things. It's not malleable, and it doesn't want change. It's like stone. It believes to be right. It doesn't accept. It doesn't open itself to the new. And for those who are fine to stay this way and to be closed within his own convictions, he will never know that there are others. He will never grow. And so that is the donkey. And that is why Jesus is represented on top of a donkey and not on top of a horse. Because the mind has to be governed. And so Jesus, that represents the being, is governing over the mind, which is the donkey. So he enters Jerusalem, or the inner worlds, on the donkey. And the donkey that's playing the harp is telling us that we need to give superior notes to our mind. One needs to know how to play music to elevate mystical elevation, ecstasy, joy, sublimation. At which point, for these processes of death and transmutation, little by little, one begins to transform the mind. At which point, the mind then becomes an ally. It becomes a wonderful tool, a bit like a lens that allows us to see everything. So it allows you to see everything. But when sight is clouded by the subconsciousness, then you don't see anything. You only see yourself, the ideas that are trapped inside of you, in the cave of Plato. And you confuse shadows for reality. So you have to transform and purify the mind from the subconscious, at which point it will become transparent. And it will reflect all the wisdom of the superior worlds. And you have access to all of the superior knowledge. So here, still in Fromista, we can see a Kabbalistic Hebrew tree of life that comes from the Kabbalah, which is the Hebrew esotericism, and then a Christ, a Christian Christ. And this shows us how there is this syncretism along the path, a gnosis. So we saw the tree of life earlier with its 10 Sephiroth, and this symbol is telling us that one's own being in a Christ needs to incarnate in one's own tree of life. So it's to take possession of all the different parts of our inner being, of all the internal parts. And as I have said, it is something that we can incarnate. This, again, is another tree of life, and is followed by the plains of Castilla, which I've spoken about. Very wide, very long, very hot, a bit like a desert, in order to indicate or represent the initiatic path. We then reach a big city, Leon. Leon is a true symbol of what we call the reincarnation of Tiferet, which means the intimate Christ within us, this actual part that enters the soul. And this is represented here in this city through this Gothic cathedral. Spain has many incredible Gothic cathedrals, but this one is the most luminous one of all, and it is correct that is represented so luminous because Christ is the light of the world. Christ is the light that enters inside of us, the being, the spiritual part that enters in us. So a cathedral with so many glass windows of so many meters creates light inside of it. And inside you have a feeling of being outside because it represents this world of the inner initiatic path, when the spiritual part enters for the first time within the soul. And now that spiritual part needs to evolve and completely develop. And this is an important passage. This is the inside of the Cathedral of Leon. It's big and you can see all of the light that penetrates inside. Okay, in Leon we find this other place which is called Saint Isidoro. So the cathedral is then not enough to represent this whole process. And in Saint Isidoro, for example, in the front part, there is the zodiac. So we can see something else that was part of the tradition. It's not today's market astrology we're talking about, which has turned into something commercial. I am talking about astrology as experience with those who govern the stars. So in everything there is consciousness, and then we have the absolute consciousness in those which are called the logos, in the world of Hermetism, and they govern worlds, planets. So a true astrologer is someone who comes in contact with these logos. So the regents of these most elevated masters that govern planets. So this is on the front part of Saint Isidoro. Okay, we can see in the end it's not just about liberating ourselves from ourselves, but also from mechanical creation. So for example, there are the famous 12 Labors of Hercules, which is a Greek-Roman myth, and it talks about liberating ourselves from the 12 zodiac signs in order to be completely free. So we're still in the city of León, where we can find this St. Mark's Hospital. And this is very interesting because the path here divides again into two different roads. There is a fork. So you can either choose the path that is called the direct path, the dry path, so this is all alchemical language. But there is a moment once one reaches this point of the inner path where some initiates stop. They stop not only because of their own will, they stop because it means their being is that which we call a being from the spiral path, the nirvanic path. So he doesn't complete the entire inner process. And they have left this division even on the Camino de Santiago. Because here in León, you could take another route which would take you towards the north, called Oviedo, because in Oviedo there is a temple which is said to hold many different relics. So many walkers would reach this point and then stop here. And instead of continuing the true path of Santiago, which takes you to Finisterre, they would be tempted to take this route at Oviedo and then just stop. And all of this is very significant because it is an internal process. Because it is true, some masters get to this point, which we call the creation of the soul. They do not incarnate the spirit, and they remain within the spiral nirvanic path, whereas others would continue the path until the very end. So once all pilgrims reach this point, they have to choose which route to take, either one or the other. Another very interesting thing in León are these teachings, for example, from Saint Isidoro or even Nicholas Flamel. They also say that Nicholas Flamel was a great master, an alchemist. He completed the great work together with his bride, Perenelle, and they became famous as a couple for the fact that both of them walked together parallel to each other, and they both lived the path at the same time all the way until reaching the being, which is a very strange thing because normally when the great work is done as a couple, very often one is ahead of the other, either the woman or the man. This is the norm. However, the fact that Nicholas Flamel and Perenelle became famous for was that they were walking side by side on the same level. And Nicholas Flamel, they say that he is the one who's left most of the teachings in this city, León. Then we can see Castilla with all its sunflowers and the trees in the background. Okay, next we reach Cruz del Ferro. It is even more understandable in Italian because of the word ferro, and this word doesn't exist in the same way in Spanish. Cruz de Ferro, if we translate it, it means the Iron Cross. And you can find these at different spots along the path, and they are little hills which were actually formed by pilgrims because with the passing of centuries there was this tradition, and this tradition also existed in Greece and among other civilizations, and it was a tradition of carrying a stone or a pebble at certain points and then throw this stone backwards. And then obviously with the passing of time, these stones accumulate and end up creating a mountain of stones. So this tradition, which was also Greek, in fact represents something that we already spoke about, because the stone represents the sex or the sexual energy, so they throw it backwards because it is backwards that the energy has to flow and rise. And on top of these stones there is a cross, and the cross, as we said, represents the union of man and woman, the lingam and the yoni. We then reach Ponferrada, where there is this castle that looks like a fairy tale. It doesn't look like a physical castle, it looks like a castle from another dimension. It's very beautiful and very particular because it has 12 towers. So we can't see the part behind in the picture, but it is very big. So each one of these 12 towers is shaped and represents a constellation of a specific star sign. So the zodiac is a collection of stars and each has a different shape. So each tower has the shape of, for example, the constellation of the Gemini, of the Libra, etc., etc. Because at this point, we are entering particular processes of death, which are very important. So we are entering a process of liberation from ourselves and nature. Okay, we reach the end of Castilla and we enter my homeland. It's all flat and you find a wall which you have to climb or to go up at S.A.W. And it's not an easy climb because it's about 1,000 kilometers that suddenly appear and you have to climb up. So after you've gone through all the plains of Castilla, all of a sudden you find this steep hill. And by climbing it, you enter the region of Galicia, where we know Santiago is found. So there is this hill at S.A.W. Okay, they say that Galicia is part of the Atlantis continent. And that's why Spain is divided. There is all this flat part, and then you reach, and there's all these rocks, hills, mountains. So they are geographically two very different parts, and there's this geological sudden change. Because they say that that part above Portugal is still submerged underwater, whereas the rest of Atlantis is this part of current Spain. So next, we're still in S.A.W., where you find these constructions that are called pallosa, which comes from the word paglia, which means hay in English, which are actually Celtic constructions, because all of my homeland, Galicia, was Celtic. So it's full of druids, menhirs, dolmens, Celtic graffitis, so it's completely Celtic. And you can still find some of stone structures with the roofs made of hay, pallosas. And they serve as testimony of these ancient ancestral pilgrimage, the land of the Druids, etc., etc. And now we reach Vilar de Dones, and as you can see, the stones in this church have many plant growths on them, because Galicia is a very humid land. When people visit in the summer, they're always surprised with how much green there is, and they always say, wow, it's beautiful, it's so green. And yes, of course it is, because it rains about 9 months a year. It looks like Ireland, and so it is very green. But yes, this is what happens to the stones. Even landmarks and monuments, after not long, they are covered with growths because of the amount of humidity. On the inside of Vilar de Dones, which again the Italian language explains very well, which means a woman's villa, because this is the place where mainly women used to come to be instructed. So when we were talking about San Juan de la Peña, I forgot to mention this, so I'll mention it now. So at many points in the path, there would be a monastery that would be dedicated to men, and then there would be one close to that would be for women. And this was all a facade because it wouldn't have been acceptable for the Christian church, so they had to maintain these form and distance. But then, of course, the truth always comes out, and when they dug and explored these monasteries, they found some tunnels which would connect the men's to the women's monasteries. Not because they had orgies or anything like that, but they used to practice sacred sexuality. which we've already spoken about. So that's why it's called Vilar de Donas, because this is where women used to be mainly taught. But very close to this, there is somewhere else where men were taught. Okay, once we reach this point, we are very close to Santiago. So whenever you see monuments rested on top of dogs, and you ask an official tourist guide why, they will tell you that it is because the dog is the symbol of loyalty and friendship, which is very vague if we're not talking about the initiatic process. It would be a shame if you went through such massive efforts to reach a point where you just had a companion. So the dog, in fact, represents the mercury, just as the cat symbolizes sulfur. And to dominate the dog represents dominating one's own animal instincts. And that's why it's here when we are reaching Santiago, because he did dominate instincts, he transformed instincts. And this is represented here because we're reaching the end of the path. You can't see it very well, but there's a dog laying at his feet, and this is a warrior holding a sword. And the dog has already been trained and is at our service. It's not us that is dominated by the dog or the animal instincts. And finally, we reach Santiago of Compostela. As you can see, it's a spectacular cathedral. Okay, let's see what Santiago represents then, because this is not where the path ends, as I have mentioned. I mentioned that it ends in Finisterre, so we'll have a look at that. However, the sepulchre is found here, which represents the final process of death of an initiate, when he has completely died within himself and has completely freed the unconscious. So he's freed all his consciousness. So one might ask, what else is there to do? Well, after this point, one has to work with superior aspects, such as the mind and other things. So Santiago is not the end, but of course it represents a very important process, which is death and the resurrection. So it's not by chance that this is where the sepulchre is found. Okay, the image is not very clear, but on the front part of the cathedral, on top of those two windows, there is an image which represents the sepulchre. Of course, to symbolize what is held inside, which is Santiago or St. James's tomb. So there is silver and gold, and it's Santiago's main symbolism. So, as I have said, internally, this point in the path is reached when a person has completed the elimination of one's own ego. He has died within himself. He is living death. Next, we have an image of Santiago, which sits on top of the sepulchre. Behind, there are some stairs which you can go up, and there is this tradition of hugging the apostle. So in the Cathedral of Santiago, there are 3 entrances, 4 actually, just as many sides. This is the east entrance, which is called Puerta de la Sabaceria, because a sabace is a black stone, and again it is representing that process from black to white. And then you exit from the other side, the west, where there is white silver, so it goes again from black to white. So here we can see the west side, where it's all silver colored, and it's called Puerta de la Plateria, silver, which is full of symbolism. So we'll have a close-up look. Okay, as you can see, there is tremendous amount of detail, so it's going to take a bit of time to go through it all, because there are many strange symbols. This one, for example, this is Jesus with Mary Magdalene. And so can you imagine one that touches the breasts of his disciple? I think not. This is to represent that Mary Magdalene is his spouse. A master would never do such thing. So Jesus is touching Mary Magdalene's breasts because she's his wife, as it is known through many Gnostic texts. And this is also to represent what we've already spoken about, which is transmutation of the sexual energy. Again, there is another depiction of Mary Magdalene, where she's holding a skull in the sexual region to indicate, yes, the psychological death process, but especially to show that the way to die is in the sexual union. Because this, which is the most powerful energy that we have, if we do not know how to control it, it will totally overcome us. and it would turn us into beasts, animals. Okay, one of the symbols that I mentioned earlier that was left by some of the builders used to leave one of their symbols. The one we see here is one of the 3 lodges that used to be in charge of all construction works along the Camino. And again, we can see the main entrance, and that staircase is formed by 33 steps, and it's a double staircase, and it looks like it's crossing over like Ida and Pingala. So when you walk through those doors, you see the Portico della Gloria, which is fantastic. It is formed by 33 images depicting musical instruments, and it represents the Ancient of the Apocalypse. In the next image, you can see the triumphant Christ, and then all those sages of the Apocalypse, which are 33. And there have been many studies. This is one from the Master Matteo, one of the masters who worked with one of the biggest stones that ever existed for the Portico della Gloria. And many of these studies show an exceptional and particular geometry that is depicted on this Portico della Gloria. We can see the Pythagorean star with 5 points. And as you can see, the vertex is pointing towards north, towards the above, which reminds us of the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, which represents perfection and balance of the 5 elements: earth, fire, water, air, ether. It's the symbol of Christ, the Philosopher's Stone. This symbol was represented by many esoteric groups, but always with the vertex, the point towards north, upwards. If the point is ever pointing downwards, it represents the complete opposite, a dark path, a satanic path, something polarized with the ego, with the unconsciousness. And I also want to show you closer up these ancients of days of the apocalypse, because it's not something that's just connected to the Christian tradition, but you can see that they're carrying some alchemical vials, one of which also has a phallic shape, represents the need for the transmutation of the mercury, Santiago. And we can see the interior side wings of the dome. This is the entrance that is opposite the main entrance, and it's called the Porta Santa, the Holy Door, because this one is only opened every 7 years during the Holy Year. And you can see a statue of Santiago above, and it's to represent that you have become Santiago. You have become Mercury. So your very own Trinity, your Osiris, Isis, Horus, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Father, Mother, and Holy Spirit, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So your inner Trinity has fully developed. The Mercury, Santiago, has allowed you to reach this point. Okay, so here we are finishing with Santiago, and towards the sea, Finisterre, there is a place that one must visit. So it is called Noia, which in Italian means boredom, but it's not boring at all. Noia, spelled with a Y, is a fantastic place because it's full of tombstones. So in the picture we see, this is one of the first images that was taken when cameras had just come out. So there are tombstones, but they're not graves. There is no sarcophagus, there's no mummies. There's no one buried here. They are just tombstones. They used to be all laid out, but they've now stacked them on top of each other because they don't know where else to put them. And they serve as a symbol, and you can see the growths on the stone. The ones that still have symbols engraved, you can find inside the church. And there are many symbols, so we're going to stop here for a second. Okay, so what do all these tombstones mean? Well, we said the Sepulchre of Santiago, that it represents those who are dead within themselves. So those who reach Noia are those that throughout centuries have done the true path of Santiago inside themselves. So they have completely eliminated the subconscious. They have died in themselves. They have left testimony, and all of those are proof of all of those who have truly walked the inner path. Many tombstones, many great masters, many who have died to the world, to the subconsciousness, to ignorance, and live awake and alive in the real world, which is not just this one, but there are many other dimensions to it. That's why there are all these tombstones, and then each one left a specific symbol. Cosmic symbols such as stars, constellations, and as we can see on others, there are symbols of the pilgrim, even though there are those who say that this has nothing to do with the Camino. And this one left a pilgrim to indicate that this is part of the Camino of Santiago. And we finally reach the end, which is Finisterre by the Atlantic Ocean. In Latin, Finisterrae means the end of land. This is for the ancient world before the Americas were discovered. So you climb a bit and you reach this point, Finisterre, where the Camino truly ends. In front of the Atlantic Ocean, which at the time was immense, because when one reaches the being, he reaches immensity, vastness. The being is united to all other beings. The being is not an individual, and in fact, one must lose his own egoistical individuality in order to reach unity of all things. So there isn't truly a better symbol of the infinite ocean, that which in Gnosis we call pleroma, or which in contemporary Gnosis we call the absolute abstract space. So this means that now you have access to everything, you are part of everything. You can feel the wind, you can feel the leaf, the prostitute, the delinquent, the saint, the mystic. You are it all, and so you feel joy and you feel pain because you have discovered, you live, and it's no longer an ideal. You truly experiment being everything. So we are all united, and of course this is beautiful, but it is also painful because, as I have said, you feel the changed or transformed souls. I prefer to say this than evolved, but you can feel these as well as those who still haven't evolved or transformed. And so you feel joy and you feel pain. And this is the absolute abstract space, which is the objective of the Camino of Santiago and the end of the path. So I finish here. Okay, if there are any questions, I'll gladly answer that. I'm going to end the talk just as I started it for those who arrived a little bit later. So this is the logo of our school. The conference served as a way to present ourselves. We are the new Gnostic Academy of Florence, and our school is found in Via Baccio da Montelupo in the Isolotto or Ponte Greve area. Via Baccio da Montelupo in Florence, number 247. And on our website, you can also find a way how to reach us via tram, via car, via bus, or you can see where there is parking. You can enter our blog, the Gnostic Academy, and even if you insert this on Google, it will appear as Accademia Gnostica blogspot.it. And there you can also find past public conferences, talks that we have done, etc. And then also how to find us. The new course begins on Tuesdays, the course for which I have shown the program. So there are 33 meetings to this that are formed by a theoretical part, which explains how to do all of this that we have spoken about today, and then, of course, a practical part. So here I also have to thank the First District of Florence, who have kindly lent us this hall for free. And we are very grateful. However, this is not our home, so it's not ideal now to switch the lights off and start meditating. Today is simply an introduction. However, next Tuesday, we're going to already be doing a practice because we like very much practical work, obviously knowing what to do beforehand. So this is going to begin on Tuesday the 20th and then every Tuesday following that. except the one straight after, because on the 27th we have a commitment. So just on that case, we are changing to Wednesday the 28th. But after that, it's always going to be on a Tuesday. So you have an extra 2 free days at the school after this to evaluate whether it's something you want to continue. And then after that, it's €35 a month. And if anyone has any questions now or comments, or you want to share an experience, has anybody done the physical Camino? Yes, I did the first stage of the French Camino. So my question was, how come you didn't treat that part of the Camino? You didn't talk about it at all. Is it a choice? Okay, the French Camino in France. Okay, this is because the Initiatic path, where the constructor builder lodges left messages, begins at the Pyrenees. But then, of course, if somebody, for example, leaves from Florence, they don't take a plane. They would leave from Florence and go through Italy, France. So there are many routes in Europe. So it's not that it's not important, but the Camino, the 900 kilometers, that is full of symbolism, begins at the Pyrenees, which is already a lot, 900 kilometers. In the images, you could actually see first the full Camino, then the double Camino, which I commented on, and then in France you can see 4 different ones, branches that actually go to form 7. And 7 is an important number symbolically. So, of course, someone may leave from Paris or Toulouse, and those 4 routes obviously have their own particularities, but we would have been here until Christmas if we'd looked into those as well. Even the Italian route, which connected to Rome, to Jerusalem. Any other questions or comments? Did the Spanish Camino come before the French Camino? Yes, originally that's where the pilgrimage began, and then other routes were added on to it. It grew. Even within Spain itself, of course, from the south of Spain, they wouldn't go to the Pyrenees. They would take a more direct route. So there were other secondary routes as Santiago became more and more popular. Okay, there are no more questions. So thank you. It's been a pleasure for us. And, oh, there's another question. Okay, Samael was the name of his being, as you can see in the picture. So Samael is the name of his being. His profane name was of Colombian origin. He was from Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and his name was Victor Manuel Gomez Rodriguez. For example, my name is Gonzalo Garcia, but this name is the name of my temporary personality, of this body. However, I have a being, you have a being, and those who walk along the Camino of Santiago internally can discover the true name of their being. That's the true path, and not only to discover it, but to actually incarnate it. So, the founder of contemporary Gnosis, Victor Manuel Gomez Rodriguez, reached the point where he fused together with his being. And in fact, during his latest talks, he would begin by saying, "He who is speaking to you is Samael Aumbeor," as if to say, Victor is not here. I have transformed him. Now it's the being that is speaking through me. So Samael was the name of his being, not of the person. The person's name was Victor Manuel, just as his wife, the master Litalante, but the woman's name was Arnolda Garro, but the name of the master was Litalantes and Master Samael. So to us, of course, they are masters, but they don't have to be your masters. As I have said at the beginning, we invite people to experience. So if I don't have any experiences in the internal worlds, why should I believe anything at all? For me, for example, I have met the Venerable Master and Litalantes many times internally, so I have no doubt that they exist. Someone asks whether they're still alive. No, they disembodied Victor around 1977 and Arnolda in 1999 because they were born in 1917. So obviously they do no longer have a physical body, but they help us internally because an awakened master helps us even without the need of having a physical body, because they live in the internal worlds, and from there they help us, they assist us, just like many masters from the White Lodge. Thankfully, the White Lodge has many masters. Okay, there are no other questions. Thanks everyone. We hope to see you soon, and if not, we wish you all the best.